that we all keep talking about the redistribution of the pie. We rarely ever talk about growing the pie. Imagine if the pie was bigger, there would be more for more people.
And welcome to the Anahita Speaker Series presented by Carnegie India, celebrating stirring stories of empowerment, struggle, and success from women professionals in different fields across the globe. Stories we hope are bound to inspire young professionals. I'm Akash Bhandari, Program Coordinator and Research Assistant with the Political Economy Program at Carnegie India. We are delighted to have with us today Pranjul Bhandari, Chief Economist India and Indonesia at the HSBC. She is responsible for developing the firm's position on macroeconomics and public policy in India, leading the firm's economics research franchise from Bombay. Prior to joining HSBC, Pranjal completed a resident fellowship at the IMF in Washington, D.C. after graduating as a Mason Fellow from the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, she worked at India's Ministry of Finance with the Chief Economic Advisor and at the Planning Commission with the Deputy Chairman. She has held roles as an economist covering Asian markets at the Goldman Sachs and at UK's Department for International Development. Welcome, Pranjal.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, just for starters, I would actually like to go back in time a bit. And I would like to ask you that, what inspired you to pursue economics as an undergraduate and a postgraduate degree? Did the state of the Indian economy in the 90s played a role in this decision? And, what were some of the professional paths that you were pondering upon back then?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of childhood experiences that played a role. My parents are entrepreneurs, so I was in a very entrepreneurial family. And through my childhood, I saw how arbit policy making or policy uncertainty was playing havoc with families and also playing havoc with economic growth for the whole nation, at large. And I had this deep burning desire to fix it in some way. Also, a few things that I sort of go back in time and I think about it, that it struck me very early in my life that we all keep talking about the redistribution of the pie. We rarely ever talk about growing the pie. Imagine if the pie was bigger, there would be more for more people. And I felt like a lot of the economists, who I read over time, or who I thought about, who we talked about, were all thinking about redistribution rather than growth. In fact, in some sort of places, growth, money were actually considered as bad words. And something felt really wrong in this whole milieu. Let's be clear here, it's not that I was like born to be an economist. I went through my whole period of like not knowing what I want out of life, especially in the 12th grade. I was conflicted. I wanted to do history, philosophy, I wanted to do maths. But then I got the marks which got me into economics in St. Stephen's College. And I had a very learned uncle who sort of made it very clear to our family that, look, if you've got that degree, you've got to do it. It's like the best. So I sort of just went into economics. So it's not that like I had this huge clarity that I wanted to be an economist. But yes, there were a lot of experiences in my childhood that did sort of lead up to it. I realize now when I think back. But I just want to say one thing here, that how like good teachers really make all the difference. Because in my first year, when I went into my macroeconomics class, it was beautiful. It was poetry. It was love. It was amazing because I realized how complex parts of the economy are all sort of interwoven with this fine thread. And if any one part gets upset, it sort of wobbles the other part. And I felt like macroeconomics was something I just had a very intuitive take for. And I was very lucky, we had a wonderful teacher, Mr. Grayval, who had just come back from the US doing his graduate studies at Princeton. I know a lot of other people have also studied under him and like really enjoyed it, but I had a very good teacher, and that was one of the few classes in which I was a front bencher. And I think that's a passion that stayed with me when I went on for my future degrees and also when I went into the workforce.
Wow, great, Pranjul. So having worked at esteemed institutions, such as the Planning Commission, Goldman Sachs, Ministry of Finance, what has been the most challenging and also the most exciting phase of your life, And are there any other lessons for the young budding economists to sort of learn from or sort of, to reflect in their own lives, maybe?
Yeah, so look, I worked in several institutions. I actually started off with the British government, then I went to Goldman Sachs, then I joined Government of India, Planning Commission, Ministry of Finance. Then for some time I went off to the IMF, and now I'm at HSBC. So I've sort of been in and out of India, and I've been in and out of the private sector. So basically alternating between public and private sector. But I think some of the experiences that really left a mark, I think one was the very intense years spent at Goldman Sachs, which really taught me how to live in a very fast pace, very uncertain, very volatile financial world, because I was in the financial markets during the 2008 global financial crisis. And suddenly seeing all the screens around you going into deep red, and not knowing how to deal with it on a minute by minute. We didn't have the luxury of sort of giving our opinion after the event had passed. You had to give your opinion real time, you had to give a trade idea real time. So that was a great experience of sorts, which I can never forget. And in a way, my experience now in HSBC is a bit similar. The other one was moving from private sector, hardcore private sector banking, to planning commission, the other end of this spectrum, sleepy weepy planning commission, where every small thing you want to do, you sort of discuss it and debate it for several years, very very different. And I think that big jump from private sector to public sector basically was a very very big adventure for me. If the private sector and Goldman was all about like IQ, how can you be the smartest on the street, this one was about EQ. How can you carry people with you when you move ahead in life? Small experiences. I was hired by Monte Carlo Valia, very good economist, but just and he headed planning commission. But as you will realize, if you work in the government, just the top guy liking you is not good enough, and it's not a guarantee that things will be smooth. You have to get the cooperation of everybody down the line. And I had it was a big EQ sort of experience for me, trying to convince people that I was there to work with them, not compete with them, because there was this big feeling always that, oh, who's she who's been helicoptered in. So a great experience, a great experience for life, and a learning role to move from private sector to public sector. Yeah, of course, I've been very lucky to have, to have some very good leaders around me. Montek was one, a fountain of wisdom, a good economist, a true economist. Like we see many people who are associated with sort of, one way of thinking or one party, and is sort of very critical of the other side. But here is one person, who's just so true to his trade of economics that it doesn't matter to him if he's in power or not. He's always constructive, and he always gives the right recommendation. So it was great to work with somebody who really cared about the art of economics beyond anything else, like personal your satisfaction or your personal success. uh, uh, and then there was Raghuram Rajan. I worked with him in the Ministry of Finance, and I would say he's one of the most inspiring people I've met in my life. I was in his core team. We did a lot of work together for the couple of years. He was a chief economic advisor, and what stood out to me was how he heard the voice of the youngest person in the room. uh, a lot of the meetings we went for, a group of people would come, but only the most senior person used to talk. Raghu had this way of involving the youngest person in the room. He was fantastic. And it worked well for me because I was the youngest person in the room at that point. And he just like let me, if I came with him, went to him with an idea, he let me run with it. And So before I knew, I was leading a lot of the work that the Ministry of Finance was doing in order to, improve the conditions for small and medium enterprises. I think those were the days that then eventually led up to things like the Mudra loan scheme. Some of the early work on that, some of the early work on reforming our Apprenticeship Act. But he just sort of, if he found somebody who was interested, he let that person take the lead. If he found somebody who was good, he had full faith in that person, and he didn't care about what, age, what was your age. So I think that was a very good experience, and I think something that I have taken with me now that I'm sort of growing in my own career. The way I treat some of the younger people in my team, I think of them as equals rather than juniors. And so that was thanks to Raghu. The and the final one was, a very lovely lady at my current office at HSBC, uh, who sort of made me aware about a lot of things, like the glass ceiling which many women face, and how do you work around that, how women can help each other. Me being an economist and a researcher at large, can get a bit too much into my own research, basically practically live in a cave. She taught me how to come out of it, in fact pulled me out, how to create my own network, how to get the cooperation of other people, so I can rise over time. And I think she was a very good female mentor that I had in life.
Okay, so now this is going to be like a little different question. So Pranjal, if you are not an economist, what other profession do you sort of picture yourself in right now? Given the current circumstances, and do you think you would still be making the contributions to the Indian economy or to the world through this alternative profession that you might be in?
Yeah, look, I had a lot of other interests, and I still have those interests. And I think my big interest was like in music. I play several instruments. I played in rock bands for almost 15 years. We used to write music. I used to write lyrics. So I think that would have, in a way, been this parallel or sort of alternate career. I'm not sure if it would impact the economy in any way, but it would be an alternate career for me. But I'm going to take a step back here. Life has become multidisciplinary. In fact, you need to be a little bit of a lot of things to succeed. Think about the greatest challenges we are going to face in the next decade or so. Something like climate change. You will need all kinds of people to sort of allow us to make a difference there. You need economists, you need scientists, you need people who understand behavior change, you need entrepreneurs. So I think the dividing lines between professions is actually blurring a lot. And I can see myself as doing something quite different, but still impacting, say, the economy. uh, uh, and I think now we also have just so many resources available that you could be A, but you could just take up a course and also be B and C, and then before you know, you're ABC, and the influence you have is just much larger than what you had thought you would about 10 years ago. So life has become extremely multidisciplinary.
Stepping back a bit here, so I would like to ask you about, like how do you maintain, like we've talked about your role at HSBC, we have talked about, your previous work experiences, but how do you manage life, and particularly your work life with other things, essentially, like what else do you do besides being an economist, uh, like during the daytime, and how do you balance it in or over in your life as a whole?
Yeah, look, I think life comes in phases. And what I try to do, what I've learned to do is enjoy each phase. Some things will be working out for you and some things will not be working out for you. And then I try to focus on the things that are working out for me and like really enjoy it to the fullest. I'll give you an example. When I moved from Goldman Sachs to Planning Commission, I had a very difficult 6 month transition where I just didn't know if I'd done the right thing. I literally came back home every day and cried. But at the same time, it took me some time to win the trust of a lot of people in government. But during that period, I suddenly seemed to have a lot of time, and then I just basically started doing a lot of other things which I had not had the time when I was at Goldman. As in, I started taking my piano lessons. I started like going to an art class. I made an artist buddy and we used to paint together. So I sort of did all of that for a couple of months, and then in that time had also sort of built a group of friends at Planning Commission, and then I went back to the work mode. So I sort of have been there in various phases, and I think that's the best way to be. Now what do I do? Look, I'm pretty busy with my work, and I also have two small kids. I have 5-year-old twin girls. Between that, but I do sort of have a guitar buddy, and we jam once in a while. So yeah, that's the stuff I do.
All right. Actually, I should have asked you this question before, but for the younger audience, what does like a day in your life looks like at HSBC? Like, what is it that you do? Maybe in like a week or like during a day. Like, what are some of the like the main things that you have to do every day?
So look, let's put it this way: that I have a very unique
Mhm.
role. I'm in financial markets because I work in a bank. HSBC is a bank. And
Yeah.
at the same time, I'm not really a banker. I'm an economist in a bank. So I have this very interesting role in which I have, like, on the one hand, I do a lot of stuff in the financial markets, and on the other hand, I do a lot of stuff with public policy, because in a way,
Mm.
economists like myself, and there are like several of us, we also participate in a lot of the policy making forums, like for example with the central government or with the government. So it's the central bank or the government or maybe some regulator. So I think my day is quite varied. It starts early because we work with markets. So I have my first
Of
meeting
course.
every morning at 7:45 a.m. And I sort of like scan the horizon on what happened in the U.S. markets before that. I'm sort of up to date by 7:45. And then we have our couple of morning meetings, which is great because it just allows you to think about, okay, this is what's happened overnight, yesterday, this is where we are. So some of the work I do is very short term, which is like, what happened in the markets. But then that's not what I do all day. A lot of our research, some of it is a little more medium term, some of it is extremely long term. That how will the Indian economy look, say, in 2030 or in 2050? We sort of opine on sort of topics like that, think about many sectors that could evolve over time and how they would evolve. So, my time is spent between very short term, medium term, and very long term. It's spent between talking to investors, but also talking to a lot of people in the government or in public policy.
Wow. I hope, maybe the young listeners out there can sort of be inspired and, sort of learn from these things, or maybe, get an insight into what the world or like the life of a chief economist looks like. So, I mean, so I know that you've pursued a master's of public administration earlier in life, right? So, could you, for like starters, share why and how a degree in public administration can add value to one's life? And I mean, why should one really pursue this degree in the first place?
Yeah, so I did my sort of mid-career kind of a public policy degree from Harvard Kennedy School. Um, I had worked for a good 10 years, and I was moving from one role to another, and I just thought that it might be a great idea. And also, I'd applied for this course long time ago. I'd been just deferring it, and I said it's going to be pretty much now or never. And then I just stepped in and did it. Now, when I went to Kennedy School, a part of me just kept thinking that, hey, I've already worked for a long time. Do I really need this? Uh, and then I thought that, okay, let me just do this, because ever since, from the time I did my graduate work in economics, the field has also moved ahead. As in, when I was studying economics, behavioral economics was just coming up. It's sort of come a long way since then. From when I studied last, there have been many innovations in technical topics like econometrics. So, in a way, I thought, let me just go and refresh my economics and come back. I went with that mindset. But when I went there, it was completely different. I was completely just in awe of the kind of resources that was available. When you go to Kennedy School, you have access to all the different schools at Harvard, from econ department to law school. You can also go to MIT. You can do all kinds of things. And what I ended up doing was a bunch of other stuff like negotiation, a class in negotiation, which was very difficult, completely out of my comfort zone, in which we had to like negotiate with other classmates on very difficult and controversial topics. Uh, I did a class on history from a very, very good professor called Moshe Temkin, who sort of, we studied about the leadership style of many important historical figures. So there was a lot of, different things, that I ended up doing. And I came back with a broader mindset. In a way, I would call it a T-shaped skill. So I went deeper in one subject because it was economics, but I also did a bunch of
Yeah.
broader topics. So like one depth and a variety of breadth.
Interesting. Okay. Let me pivot to some, Indian economy questions now. So before the pandemic hit, the Indian economy was already slowing down, with the year-on-year GDP growth, and I think from April to December to 2019, it was just about 4.2%. So, what do you think were the causes for that slowdown? And now, do you think sort of those problems have now been addressed?
Yeah, I think two main reasons for the slowdown then. One was India's twin balance sheet problem. The fact that both our bank balance sheets and corporate balance sheet had just too much debt. Corporates were highly indebted, so they were not being able to repay loans, and therefore non-performing loans, bad debt in banks was just building up. And when your two main economic entities have troubled balance sheets, their investment doesn't happen. And for 10 years, India's investment rate had actually been falling. And then, if you don't have investment, then your capacity to create jobs falls, your capacity to give good wages, to create GDP growth, all of that falls. So we were in a vicious cycle, if I can say that. It's a bit harsh, but if I can say that, that investment was falling, potential growth was falling, and it all culminated into this very slow year of 2019. What happened in the pandemic was very interesting because we went through 2 years or 2 to 3 years of excess liquidity. All the central banks got really nervous with the pandemic and started infusing a lot of liquidity in the markets to support growth, to protect growth at these difficult times. And what our corporates and banks were able to do in this period was use this liquidity to clean up their balance sheets. So a lot of the corporates shed debt, and a lot of the banks raised money and improved their capitalization ratios. So we've come out of this pandemic with much more cleaner balance sheets of both banks and corporates than we had before the pandemic. So that is a positive story. It's very good. But there's another story to it too. I think another sector that wasn't doing well before the pandemic was India's informal sector. You know, it's not just your agriculture workers in rural India, but it's all of your small micro enterprises. Everybody who's not in the formal security net. The informal sector workers. The informal sector was not doing well. There had been two back-to-back shocks. There was GST implementation, a great reform, but it was disruptive for this sector in the short run. And then there was demonetization, which was also a disrupting factor for this sector because it's a very cash intensive sector. So the informal sector wasn't doing well. Unfortunately, through the pandemic, they were faced with even more challenges. One was the lockdown. It was hard for small firms to withstand lockdowns. They don't have cash buffers, so it was hard for them to withstand lockdowns. And then there was last year's commodity price increase, the sudden rise in the price of all kinds of commodities. And these small firms face the brunt because they don't have great bargaining power when they go and they buy all of these raw materials from the market. So it's been several shocks in a row for the informal sector. And I think that sector still has a lot of recovery in front of them. As in, last couple of months, I'm seeing some signs of recovery, but a lot more I think has to happen. So that's one problem which is not yet fixed.
So, Pranjal, like, I mean, would you say that the Indian economy has changed after the pandemic? And if yes, sort of in what ways have we changed?
Yeah, I think, while we were locked up at home, two new amazing sectors took off in India. One of them is high skill exports. And it's not just, your mobile handsets, drugs and pharma, automobile parts, but it's also high skill services. Services got a shot in their arm. It was working from home became more acceptable. And then, of course, it sort of opened up, new doors for India's IT services sector. But interestingly, it was not just IT services. I think other forms of IT export of services exports, like professional services exports, R&D, design, all of that has like really taken off. Today India's services exports is getting us, net exports is getting us about $12 billion a month. In 2019 we were getting $6 billion a month. So it's sort of doubled in its scope and its capacity. What I'm finding most interesting is a lot of MNCs are putting up their back offices in India, except that these back offices are not just doing back end work anymore. Over time they're also doing a lot of front end work, for instance research and development, design, and so on and so forth. So that's a very good sector that has taken off. Another big sector that has taken off is the whole startups, right? In the pandemic period, India startups were able to attract $120 billion of foreign funding, and they grew in leaps and bounds. But in my view, I think the best days are yet to come. I find the startups right now focused most in the services sector, e-commerce, fintech, edutech, health tech, and all of that. But I think once all of these startup founders become more ambitious and they go into manufacturing, digitization of manufacturing, or agri-tech, then I think there can be huge growth payoffs. So I'm very excited about that part. So two new exciting sectors that arose through the pandemic period.
So you already sort of touched upon, like startups, like high skill services and sort of how exports have gone up in the past 2, 3 years. So given that, where do you see and how do you see the future of the Indian economy evolving from here on? And what are some of the things that also worry you at the same time that, like, let's say, for instance, if there's a certain sector that we don't reform properly, we might not be able to catch up, let's say, if it's manufacturing. So just, so given that, what are some of the things that you're excited about, maybe at HSBC or just at, personally also?
Yeah, look, there is what I call new India. It's these two new sectors: high tech exports, startups, all the exciting, glitzy stuff. Uh, my sense is that if new India really takes off, then our GDP growth over the next 10 years could be about 6.5% a year. This is higher than the 6% growth on average that we were seeing on the eve of the pandemic. So it would be actually higher than, post-pandemic growth could be higher than pre-pandemic growth if new India really takes off. But I'm going to pause here for a second. Is 6.5% growth good enough? Whenever I think about it, sector by sector, I find that it's not good enough, because new India is exciting, but it's only 15% of India's GDP, and it's only 5% of India's labor force. What happens to 85% of India's GDP, and what happens to the remaining 95% of India's labor force? We need more than the new India for the India's economy to truly be a great economy. And I have to come back to old India. And old India is your manufacturing, which is not high tech, so your medium tech, low tech manufacturing, your agriculture. We need to really reform that. And I think that is the big challenge. Will India be 6.5% growth economy, but not enough jobs, and therefore question marks around how that growth will be sustained? Or do you want it to be a even higher growth economy which also creates the jobs? Of course you want the latter. How do you get the latter done? Why hasn't old India taken off? I think one of the reasons in old India hasn't taken off is there are a lot of reforms that still need to be done. Actual labor reforms, actual land reforms, actual ease of doing business reforms, and these take a lot of time. Thankfully, what we have right now as maybe a gap filler is the rise of India's public digital infrastructure. And my hope is that at some point, all of these startup founders will think about things like digitization of manufacturing, agri tech, and really make an effort to raise old India. And I think that's when we could see some real growth. Let me give you an example. Think about, like, the glassware factories, very, very small, one room type of units strewn across UP. Think about a startup that brings together about 2,000 of these firms, combines their raw material order, gets them bulk discount when they are buying their raw material, combines their output, gives them access to large export markets, teaches each of these firms how to maintain a credit history and therefore get access to bank credit via new things like credit aggregation. Teach them logistics, smart logistics. Teach them digitization of manufacturing, how at every step there can be quality controls digitally mandated on your processes. they can actually help small firms simulate scale, and a lot of sort of payoff can come from that. And I think those things make me excited. Anything that can lift old India and can get us higher than 6.5, hopefully between 7.5 to 8% growth, because that is what we need. What do I worry about? I worry about reforms not taking off or reforms not continuing. There are still many reforms that have to get done, from power sector reforms, skilling, education, health, getting an institutional framework for dealing with climate change, agriculture reforms. Many of these will need years of consensus building. Reforms don't happen overnight, they need years of building consensus. Remember GST, it was 10 years in the making, right? So if that whole wheel of reforms, somebody constantly working at at sort of building a coalition for reforms, that stops or that doesn't move, I think that's the biggest risk we may face.
Pranjal, thank you for the comprehensive, view on India's economy and especially on how can we take this forward. So as you know, this is India's year of, G20 presidency. So given that you have said about health tech, agri tech, DPIs especially, so how does that tie in with India's G20 presidency? And how can we sort of you know champion this forward and sort of not just within the G20 countries, but using G20 as a platform to also promote it among other nations in Africa, in the global south. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot that we can spearhead in the G20 agenda. But I think one thing that I feel very passionate about is this entire public digital infrastructure that we have. Uh, I think in complex economies like, say, India or like Indonesia, which has so many small sort of islands, I think service delivery to some extent, and also distribution of benefits and all of these things can really benefit from a public digital infrastructure. And I think India's Aadhaar is very unique, and there is a lot of efforts in helping other countries also set up their own public digital infrastructure. And I think that could be one area where we really spear ahead.
All right, so in the beginning, I think you mentioned that we have always been focused on redistribution of wealth, income, all that stuff, and instead of that we should sort of focus on build like sort of, was it about having more pie rather than redistributing the pie, right? So for young scholars like me and others, like people who are watching this, what are some of the lessons, and what are some of the last tips that you would like to share with me and the others, and how can we help in playing a role in building this new India, whether it's in the area of reforms, DPIs, stuff. So what are some of the lessons that that you would like to share with us today?
Well, look, in terms of lessons, I think, my sense is that we have a lot of new tools in our hand. The public digital infrastructure is a tool in our hand we never even dreamt of about 5 to 6 years ago. Uh, 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 you know, be ambitious. Don't only think about e-commerce or sort of, they are important, but don't limit yourself to only like the top few sectors where the digital public infrastructure has really taken off, like fintech and all of that. Think about harder problems. India's biggest problem is its manufacturing sector. It's been very low at 20% of GDP for multiple decades. Too many firms remain too small for too long. They never get competitive, they never create enough jobs. Can the public digital infrastructure be used to pull up this sector? Because if we can do that, and we'll be the only country doing that, like through a digital means, picking up a sector which is a very real economy sector, uh, I think the gains can be immense. So, not shy away from challenges and not shy away with something just because it's not been done before.
All right, Pranjal. Thank you so much for this fantastic insights on the state of the Indian economy, the future of New India, and basically sharing some bits and pieces from your own personal journey. That is definitely inspiring for me and the other listeners out there. So, Pranjal, we are truly delighted that you could join us for Carnegie India's Anahita Speaker Series. To our audience, we hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Do visit Carnegie India's YouTube channel to access all the episodes of the Anahita Speaker Series. Thank you and see you next month.